Hi everyone, thank you for joining the February ITCC member meeting today. To start off, I will have just a couple of announcements and then we will head into our presentation, Lessons Learned from Taking a Performance-Based Exam to China, being presented by our ITCC Education Chair, Clyde Seepersad, General Manager of Training and Certification at the Linux Foundation. Reminder, if you will be attending our spring in-person member meeting in Orlando, Florida, please register so that we can ensure to have an appropriate count for the meeting. The networking member dinner will be taking place Saturday, March 16th at 6:30 p.m. and then the member meeting will be at the Hyatt Regency on Sunday. So the ITCC virtual member meetings, we are looking into switching platforms from using GoToMeeting to Microsoft Teams. If any of our members have experience using Teams, we ask, send your feedback to info@itcertcouncil.org so that we can just gather more information before we make any final decisions. Here is a reminder of our task force schedules with our meetings once a month. If anyone is interested in joining any of the task forces, please email info@itcertcouncil.org and we will get you all of the information that you need in order to join in the conversations. And so those are our announcements for this month. And with that, we will go ahead and I will hand it over to Clyde.
All right, thank you. I'm just, yep, here it is. Share. All righty. Let me know when that comes up for everybody.
I see it.
All right. Well, thanks all. Appreciate the opportunity to present. Although I will make a plug that this was my, in my role as education coordinator, this was my break glass in case of emergency presentation. I really need some volunteers, folks, to propose topics to cover in our April and May meetings. Next month is March, so we have our member meeting in person. So we don't do a web meeting that month. But please, if you have topics of interest, do reach out to me. And let's get those on the schedule for either April or May. End of advertisement. What we wanted to talk about today is give some insights into what has been I think at this point, a 1.5 year long journey of trying to deliver performance-based exams into China in a more structured way than what we had been doing. What happens and has happened historically, which is people from China end up taking it using the same exam regions and the same proctoring systems as the rest of the world, which is not ideal because of some cultural things, the Great Firewall, so we'll get into that. Just a quick recap on the Linux Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization in the open source software space that is running, I think over this point, over 50 different projects across a range of different topic areas, not just Linux, although Linux is still a big part of the portfolio, but we have really active portfolios in the cloud native space with technologies like Kubernetes. In the blockchain and distributed ledger space, we have a project called Hyperledger. And there's a bunch of activity in the networking space for 5G technologies, really is built on top of a stack of open source technologies, and so on and so forth. And what that means for my team, which does the training and certification, is we're developing a lot of performance-based exams and when we first started off, it was just the 2 Linux exams at the top, but we've now got, as you can see, there's 8 live, there's 2 more pending to go live before the end of June. One on Node.js, which is a programming language, and another on a 5G networking technology. So we've got a pretty big portfolio of exams, all of which are performance-based, primarily performance-based. And as you might imagine, for this range of technologies, one of the big target markets is China. And we've long sort of pondered how best to serve the Chinese market. And so what we want to talk about today is a little bit on, some of the specialness of the China market, where we are in terms of what we're trying to solve, and then some of the issues that we ran into. And then, Andrea, are folks muted centrally, or is everybody able to unmute and contribute as we go?
Either one. So I typically don't take care of anyone's mute or unmute. They can definitely do that themselves.
Good. Okay. So yeah, please chime in. I'm particularly interested if anybody else has experiences in China, so that's way it doesn't turn into a 30-minute monologue from me. But so please weigh in if you have comments, observations, or experiences as we go to sort of help bring this to life some more. If nothing else, it'll help me. Liz Clyde is also on the call, who manages this project for us at the Linux Foundation, and it'll help us not feel so alone to know that others are out there.
Hello, out there.
Hey, Liz. All right, so just a quick history tour. This is something we get told a lot when we talk to folks in China. It's like, we have a, almost 3,000-year history of doing exams. Great, and it's true. They have a very long and deep history back to 1,000 or so years before the Common Era. And with all the sorts of good intents that we see today, right, to be able to award things on merit instead of on who you know. So it is a fairly unique market in that it's deeply ingrained historically to have proctored examinations. And as you all know, this is a huge, huge market. We're talking about 20% of the world's population. It's probably more of that, a higher percentage in terms of the tech economy. And if you look at things like the cloud market, if you look at things like the telephone market, they're the number one market in both. There's more cell phone towers in China than there are in Europe and the US combined, serving 1 billion people. So, for instance, with the 5G networking exam that's coming live, China is going to be a really big part of that. So some of the feedback we've gotten is this preference for live proctored, so in-person traditional proctoring, which is actually different for us at LF because we've historically done all online remote proctoring, but we are getting this feedback around, the couple of 1,000-year history and the preference for the prestige that comes with doing exams in person. And there's a pretty good infrastructure for that, right? So you have things that happen on college campuses with these huge mass administrations of several hundred candidates at a time, an even bigger scale than what you tend to find in the US with some of the mass exams like the GRE or the GMAT. So definitely, well-oiled machine in terms of just the way in which the exam processes work in China as well, and the preference for doing that in person. When you look at the China market, you think, okay, there's really a concentration along the coast, right? And so, the darker red, the higher the population density, the lighter green, the less densely populated. So there's a lot of geographic coverage. yeah, there are, the whole swath of the east coast of China, all the way up and down, that is pretty densely populated. Um, that needs to be served. But it does get to be a little bit more challenging as you move out west into the desert. And not unlike the U.S., which looks like this with a mirror image, right? Heavy on the coast and the upper Midwest, and then lighter in the middle. So figuring out partners who can have full geographic coverage is challenging. And then, of course, as you all know, there are some infrastructural challenges. The Great Firewall is only ever gets more complicated. They are very, very good at screening things out. In fact, we just had an issue with our Kubernetes exams that two of the major sources of registries for building Kubernetes containers are unavailable in China. They block it. So we had to go.
Clyde?
Yes.
Clyde, sorry to interrupt. This is John here,
Sure.
but are we supposed to be seeing slides change? Because I'm still seeing the first title slide of your presentation.
Oh, you are supposed to be seeing them. Is anybody else not on slide 8?
No.
Slide 0.
They're not advancing.
Yeah, we're
Oh.
still on the first one, Clyde.
I thought, wow, man, this is a really long discussion on this title slide.
Right. All right. Let's see. Maybe.
Do you have a
I will try.
double monitor? It may just be showing the wrong screen.
No, it isn't. I actually dropped down to just one monitor for. Okay, let's do this. I will. Well, you guys have been missing all my glorious graphics here. Let's try this again.
Yeah, you got to start over now.
Thanks. Right. No, I wouldn't do that to you guys. All right. You should be with me now.
Yep.
Are you with me
Thank
on
you.
slide 8?
Yep, thank you.
All right. Thanks for flagging that, John. New bug in GoToMeeting. All right. So the infrastructural considerations, the Great Firewall is pretty gnarly. And we had to do some workarounds to remirror stuff so that container registries could build. But the biggest challenge is the latency, right? So for our exams, we aim to have sort of at the 95th percentile latency of less than 300 milliseconds. The problem is that the China firewall in and of itself introduces latency of 300 to 400 milliseconds. So just the act of coming through the firewall makes it difficult for candidates if the exam is not being hosted within China, because the firewall tax basically pushes everybody into a zone where the exams are laggy. And then on top of that, you have censorship type issues. So for a period of a couple of years, actually, the Chinese government was cracking down on sites where you could do social video. And because the proctoring solution that we have in place uses WebRTC technology, there's certain days where the Chinese censors would just block it. And so nobody could do an exam on those days because the proctors couldn't access the candidate's video feed and desktop. That appears to have receded. We haven't had reports of that, but it's just symptomatic of some of the operational challenges within China, where you're just constantly having to be on alert to how the technology is changing and ready to adapt. It's obviously not fun to have to tell every candidate on a given day that, sorry, the firewall is closed for business. There'll be no exams until it reopens. This is not surprising. There are serious security concerns. So one of the side effects of 3,000 years of exam taking and proctoring history is also 3,000 years of practice in evading proctor the restrictions of a proctored environment. And it's definitely something that you need to be mindful of, especially when it comes to finding local partners, right? If you're going to do exam administrations locally. And PSI has been a great partner for us here, helping to identify test center networks that have high integrity test center networks, which, as it happens, also more expensive than some of it. There's a lot of lower cost options that are really bad in terms of their track record. But clearly something to be mindful of that in terms of the candidate, their propensity to find security incidents. I will say that, and this is one area where having a performance-based test really helps a lot, because the candidates really do have to know how to do the work, right? They're not just selecting an answer A. They have to actually work in a live system. And some of you have probably listened in on other presentations we've given about the way LF does exams. Excuse me. In that the items are not static. We do some randomized variation on individual parameter values. So each candidate gets a slightly different version of the question, which does make cheating harder. But just as a general lesson learned, this is the security issue is very real, and you have to pay a lot of attention to it, and particularly attention in selecting your partner organization, and doing some of the secret shopping type things that you probably already do some of, even stateside. It's almost interesting. There is they're not shy. They've had riots of candidates not being allowed to access secondary resources, which is surprising. You probably wouldn't see that in any other market. All right, so that's some history and context. And again, I'll invite anybody who's got experience in China to just unmute and chime in as we go. But we have got to get the tests inside the firewall. We have today candidates that take the exam using this standard infrastructure, which is proctoring outside of China and exam delivery hosted outside of China. It's just not a satisfactory experience. The lag is too high. The technology risks of them shutting down the outside access to things like the web sharing technology. It's too high. We really need to find a better way to serve the client. And we had to assess what all the options were, right? So, could we do remote proctoring, or do we need to go to the sort of mass in-person administration that the market is used to? And I will say that what initially was a pretty impregnable wall of opinion that it had to be done in person and you had to do these mass administrations, we are seeing it chip away just a little bit. We're getting a little bit more feedback around people seeing value in being able to take the exam remotely on their computer. And so right now we're actually pursuing both options, both a traditional remote proctoring option and a in-person sort of traditional test center model. And we'll get those both into market and see how they pan out. But there's definitely some cracks appearing in what had been a pretty monolithic set of feedback around having to be in-person proctored. So some of this we talked about before. Sometimes the network is just out, and there's not a lot that you can do about it, right? It's sort of external to your control. If you're hosting in even Japan, for instance, we host one of our mirrors is in Japan, and that's the closest geographically to China, but it's still the tax on the latency is just it's too high. So it turns out that
Clyde?
Oh, go ahead.
I'm really curious.
Yes.
I'm
Question.
curious to see what. Go ahead, Owen.
Oh yeah. On the previous slide, just a question, if you don't mind me pushing the point there. Unacceptable candidate experience. The customer lives within that setting, so I certainly would think this would be totally unacceptable. But I'm wondering, do you have feedback from within China that that's unacceptable? Do you understand? It might just be.
Yes, I see what you mean, exactly. Yeah, and this is something we have asked ourselves. The individual customers who register online seem willing, are much more forgiving than you or I would be,
Yes.
because you're right, they're used to sort of operating in that environment. Where it becomes an issue is when we move up one level and we're trying to do deals for mass training with some of the bigger technology companies. And they are they are not willing to be flexible because they're putting, a couple hundred people at a time through some of these programs. So you can, if you're doing and our experience has been, if you're doing a sort of purely, I guess the lingo is B2C, right? If you're doing a purely sort of end user focused, you could probably get away with it. But you're only getting away with it because the customers will tolerate an experience that they wouldn't tolerate in most other countries. But once you start doing bigger corporate deals, it does become an issue.
Thanks. Makes a lot of sense.
Alrighty.
I wanted to hear from Graham if they had any data on TrueAbility's where I guess where are TrueAbility's servers when it comes to China. You guys deliver, this is your what you do, so what's your experience with China been, or if anyone else from TrueAbility's there?
Yeah, it was interesting actually, because I think you had a question, Clyde, to any issues or any experience from TrueAbility's side, and I believe the information we provided to you around talking about latency, because we obviously connect directly to Japan, so basically the way that we run our platform. So in terms of latency there, we obviously connect directly to Japan. That's our way round. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Not
no,
very.
I think so, Graham.
I
was just going to say, Graham, I'm about to, these next couple of slides, we talk about what it takes to actually get approval to set up an account inside the firewall. And I think it'll get to some of the issues you guys have probably faced at TrueAbility with the trade-off of doing hosting from Japan instead of hosting inside the firewall.
Okay, so sorry. So I probably didn't answer the question very well. I've jumped 2 slides, so we'll wait, shall I? And then we can maybe
Okay.
time in then. Okay.
Sure. Thanks, Graham. So it is quite a journey, and I will say that this is a preview presentation of one that Beth Kalinowski from PSI and Liz, who's on the phone, will give at ATP in a couple of weeks. And when we proposed this topic, I think it was in October, November last year was when submissions were due. We were anticipating already being live. And so, one of the lessons learned is a lot of patience in China to actually get all the stuff right. It's been, we've found every rock we've lifted, we found something strange and ugly that needed to be addressed. So a word to the wise, it's going to take probably 2 to 3 times as long as you might imagine before you're finally up and running. So some of the major components, the first one I talked about a little bit before, which is to find a local partner, particularly if you're going to use the test center delivery model. But even if you're not using the test center delivery model, I'll talk about on the next slide, some of the requirements for getting the authorization to have a cloud hosting account. But that's one thing. This is experience that pretty much every Western company has had in China, right? You're almost required to use a local partner to help you navigate some of the bureaucracy. It is very, very difficult to go into China alone. We use a firm called Pacific Advantage, PAL, that has a lot of experience bringing technology companies into China. And it's just part of the tax of doing business that I've not come across anybody who's been able to directly participate in the China market without using a local partner. There's other parts of the world, of course, where that's also true, and Saudi Arabia stands out. But it's definitely step one, right? Is who's your local partner going to be, unless your organization happens to have a full team and infrastructure in country, China team that you can leverage. Obviously, you got to identify which domain names you're going to use, and some of the mechanics. Anybody who's done cloud hosting to date will be familiar with this. Is figure out your domain, figure out who your cloud provider is going to be, and then get set up. Figure out what the payment gateway structure is going to look like, which is also a little bit challenging. In fact, for the China market, what we anticipate doing is using sort of local partners to sell and distribute the exam codes, and they collect payment, and we basically sell them the exam codes in bulk, and then let them handle the payment collection, because payments in China and then remitting the funds. And there's a whole new layer of legislation in China around nonprofits and how they operate. And so you have to be very careful about that if you're a nonprofit organization like the LF is. So the way we had to structure it is we couldn't go, or we couldn't easily go in and just set up a cart in China and start taking payments in country in yuan. And so we're going to use a set of reseller partners who we will contract with essentially out of the US, get them their coupon codes, and then they can collect their payments locally. So that the financial side of this is something that you have to pay pretty close attention to. Obviously, probably majority of folks on the call are not nonprofits, so that piece doesn't affect you, but you still need to pay attention to the mechanics of how you're going to get the dollars into and out of the country. And again, your partner organization would probably be quite helpful here in figuring out how to set that up so that you don't run afoul. And then you have to get a ICP license, which is a license to run a website, which of course, I don't know that any other country requires this, but you can't just stand up a website in China. Even after you have gotten permission to stand up a cloud account, we actually use AWS as a partnership with Chinese telephone company called Cinet. And even after you get your cloud account, it's actually not in itself enough. You separately have to have this ICP license to stand up a public website that can be accessed. So it is really a multi-level process of just trying to get set up to be compliant in the first place. It's just very different from probably anything else that you would have run into. So the ICP license, it's pretty serious business. You have to have this whole approval process with the Chinese government to be able to, and you need the ICP license before you can get an AWS account. So they're current and they're dependent on each other. But things like, your website footer needs to always show what the license is. And they are dead serious about this. In fact, one of the things they require is that the license, to get the license, you have to name an individual who is resident in China. That is basically if you're unhappy, here's who should arrest person. So our partner actually had to name an individual, I think it was like a great aunt of theirs, whose name is on the forms as this is the person to go arrest if the Chinese government is unhappy with you about what you're putting on your website. It's quite extraordinary. another reason also why you probably want to use a partner organization, because I suspect even if you do have China employees, they will probably not be happy to put their name up for consideration on this form. But you do have to, it's the one of the upfront requirements is you have to figure out how you're going to do this, and who's going to sign off as the responsible person. And if you don't have the license, then you can't open the key ports 80 and 443, which means nobody can get to you on the web. And of course, all the hosting providers play along, right? Because they're required to. So the ICP license journey is not for the faint of heart. So here's kind of what the flow looked like. So they had to get a tax number, which is what our partner organization provided with, and then you had to get the license. They had one initially for Alibaba. We had to transfer that because Alibaba, we wanted to be able to leverage the AWS infrastructure because that's where we host a lot of our other exams. So then we had to go get that license translated. And then incredibly frustratingly, after all of that, once we got in and we had the ICP license and we got the credentials for the AWS Beijing region, it turns out the AWS Beijing region is unlike every other AWS region on the planet, is not the same. And so all our images, which we thought we'd be able to just deploy in, and by the way, you also cannot import an AMI, an Amazon machine image, into the Beijing region. You have to rebuild it, which is also ridiculous and painful. But even after you've done that, because it's not a true Amazon, it's really their rebranding a service from Cinet. The infrastructure is different. So after all the administrative hoops, you still have technical hoops to jump through to figure out all the subtle ways in which that region is different than every other region. I can't speak for the other services, Google and Azure and others, as to how consistent their infrastructure is. But our experience is that the Amazon Beijing region is in fact not like Amazon regions everywhere else on the planet. There's an example here of some DNS routes we're missing, but it's just, there's a whole other technical sort of troubleshooting that had to happen after the license. Sorry, you had a question? Yeah.
So sorry, Clyde. I wanted to do a better job of answering Nate's question about TrueAbility's experience working with candidates that wish to take exams from inside the wall. So I've actually got Dusty, who's our CTO, who's happy just to take a moment just to talk through that experience. Would that be useful?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Dusty.
Yeah, so our experience with trying to host from inside China is that it's not very reliable. And to sort of verify what Clyde said, the services that are offered inside China don't match the services that are offered outside China. So we don't want to do a lot of work customizing things just for China. So we've kind of punted. And what we found is that sometimes, depending on basically the day of the week or the hour of the month or something, sometimes you can connect to an encrypted server. All of our servers need to connect back to an AWS instance in Virginia. And so sometimes you can connect and sometimes the firewall blocks you, and there's no real rhyme or reason to why these things happen. So we've sort of given up on hosting directly from inside China, and we've just gone to the nearby regions of China, like Shanghai or Singapore. And then we can build there the same way that we do every other place, because all the infrastructure outside is the same. And then we make it the candidate's responsibility to be able to connect to that HTTPS instance that's running for them. And they have a much greater chance, and it seems that they don't get blocked as much as we do when we try to do our internal work.
Nate, is that a better answer to your question than the half-assed job I was doing?
No, that makes sense. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Marvelous. Okay.
Thanks, guys. So yeah, it's just, it is quite a process, both administratively and technically. And so you definitely want to have a tech-savvy local partner to help you sort of navigate through this. It turns out the English skills of the Amazon Beijing support desk are, shall we say, dicey. And so our tech team in this particular case, which is based out of Australia, they did not have the usual challenges of time zone, but they did have some language issues to work through. And then we talked about sort of the patience required. We've been whacking our way at this pinata for a while now, and fingers crossed, we think it's about to break open, but it's definitely taken far, far longer than we had anticipated. But wait, there's more. After all that was done, we then ran into a different set of issues within the test centers. So we had the license, we had the exams provisioned up, we did the rework on the Kubernetes missing registries, and we were able to get all that set up. But then we were having issues with the proctoring partners locally because of the way in which they had their browsers locked down. And so there were some pop-ups that are required to run our exams that weren't popping up, which means that the candidate could register for the exam, they could schedule for the exam, they could go to the test center, they could be admitted, they could start the exam, but they could never see any of the exam content because of this security issue, which was really frustrating. So now we have a whole other cycle going on how to address that. Should we set up separate dedicated machines that don't have that restriction in place? Do we look at a different partner organization? Do we abandon the test center model and just use a remote proctoring model? And so that answer to that is still TBD. We're working through it, but it is just when we thought we were done, it turns out that there were problems even within physically on the machines within the test centers in the way that they were locked down. And this is probably somewhat unique to the LF because we don't use the PSI engine to deliver our content. We actually deliver the content externally in via JSON to the browser, which is why we didn't stumble across this until we were actually live trying to test, because it's only our implementation method of sending the content that got blocked. And then, of course, there's other challenges. It's a huge time zone difference, right? It's a day and night, literally, time zone difference with China. So the communication can be laggy, including with your partner organization, as well as the obvious language difficulties. I was mentioning earlier the support desk for the Beijing region. So just be prepared for some of these practical considerations as well. And here's what we're considering, which is to work with the local exam partners to get outside the secure browser for the purposes of our exams. As you can imagine, that is a whole new level of logistics for the testing partner to have non-secured browsers available for testing only for our exams and segregating them out. So that's, but it's a bit of a necessary evil, just given that last hurdle. So yeah, I know this has sounded a little. There's been probably a little bit of a tone of, I guess I would say, disappointment. It is challenging. There's a reason not a lot of people are live in China, but it's such a big market. You have got to, if you're a big international program, you just have to figure out how to get in there and better serve this market. It really is opening up, certainly for technology organizations like the ITCC membership. And so, hopefully others can learn from what our experience is, at least in terms of anticipating what the potential challenges might be. I need a sip of water, and it's Q&A time. So if you want to unmute and weigh in with questions or comments. Did I lose everybody?
Sounds like quite the challenge.
All right. I don't know. I don't think there's a firewall lag on the voice connection. Anybody else on the call has had experience trying to operate in China?
We have this is Elwood Fisher National Instruments, and we have a very small program, and some of our adaptations are looser, I think most of you are aware, than a larger organization might be able to do. We do have a branch of the company in China, and so they handle that. Even so, we just do in person, so we don't have any of these technology issues. You had listed that as one of your 3 options that you had considered, and we do have it seems a higher percentage and more involved of the, I love the term, non-independent test taking. We even had one of our someone in one of our branches undertook to hand out one of our actual exams as preparation material. We have several scenarios, and one of those scenarios we can't use in China because it was literally distributed here, get ready for the exam. So
it falls under the right to cheat clause.
It's a strange place, yes.
Okay, and I am seeing a question from Susan in the chat. What we would do differently is set expectations internally about how long it's going to take. We had one of our major project organizations, the Cloud Native Foundation, which runs Kubernetes, had an event in China in November, and we had naively undertaken that we would be ready for it back at start of 2018, thinking it couldn't possibly take us 11 months, but it's February and we're still working out the last kinks. So I think we would have been a lot more cautious on setting expectations of what it would take. It never occurred to us that there'd be this many hurdles to cross. So if any of you is getting beeped and probed on this, you can share a cautionary tale to set timeline expectations appropriately.
Clyde, I did want to just add that I don't know the exact number. I've just asked somebody to find out for me, but we do actually offer a number of exams today to candidates that are based in China. We are able to offer that today. I'm not sure if things maybe change in the future, but we do, and I can obviously find out the exact number, but there are a number that we currently offer today.
Right, and that's true on our side as well, right? We do have candidates who are taking the exams hosted from outside China with proctors from outside China. It's just, every morning you wake up and you check to make sure that the whole thing hasn't come crashing down, because the firewall is, the folks who run the census groups in China really have carte blanche to do whatever they feel like on any given day. So it feels very brittle, even though we've had probably a year of no firewall instances. We know from past experience that those can crop up any day at any time. And it's it's a scary way to live if you're trying to really scale up and start doing thousands of exams in China. It really forces you into having to grapple with what it takes to be live inside the firewall.
Absolutely agree, and in fact, unfortunately, as much as I'd like to say thousands, we've delivered 260 today in China. So just to give you an idea of the numbers, and what's interesting is that you mentioned just what a huge opportunity it is. So yeah, I agree. Up until a point where we're prevented on delivering, then we'll still continue.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a market of sort of hardy individuals that don't mind jumping through whatever hoops are required. And even for them, it's gotten harder, right? It used to be that pretty much everybody who was even remotely tech savvy would just pop a VPN connection and bypass the firewall. There have been serious criminal enforcements against people using VPNs, and that practice has been basically wiped out over the past year or so. So it's just very challenging. Right. Anybody else? Thoughts, observations, questions? And if you have questions that occur to you after the meeting, feel free to follow up. I know Andrea will, as usual, post the recording of this meeting to the member area on the drive so that you can listen in or share with a colleague. And feel free to ping me if you have more in-depth questions, or Liz for that matter, about what our experience has been trying to get live in the market there. All right, with that, I guess I will tag out, and Andrea, back to you.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. As Clyde mentioned, we will have the video posted on YouTube soon, as well as his presentation available on the Google Drive, and you'll get all of that information in an email shortly. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, info@itcertcouncil.org. And with that, I will let everyone enjoy the rest of their day. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks all.